Welcome, listeners. You are about to experience a thrilling mystery written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare to be immersed in a tale of manipulation, deception, and a cursed artifact that controls all who come near it. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Ghostly Locket of London. The fog had settled in thickly across London as Sherlock Holmes stepped out of the cab, his coat fluttering against the chilly evening air. The streets seemed to close in on him, their narrow, crooked paths hidden beneath layers of mist. London, with all its grandeur and history, now seemed a mere shadow of itself, a city haunted by secrets, a place where darkness lingered longer than the light. The soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps echoed as Holmes moved briskly toward the imposing gates of the Monroe estate. He had been summoned here for a case that promised to be as enigmatic as the city itself. The carriage pulled away behind him, the wheels clicking against cobblestones. Holmes did not turn to look. His gaze remained fixed ahead. He was a man used to methodical observation, accustomed to reading the smallest details that others might overlook. His sharp eyes scanned the estate's front gates, the ornate wrought iron twisting and curling like the intricate pattern of a spider's web. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a quiet evening. To Holmes, it was a prelude to something far more complex. The estate loomed before him, an aged mansion that bore the weight of forgotten years. The windows, darkened by age, reflected nothing but the oppressive fog. It was here that the mystery would unfold, and Holmes could already sense the faint, lingering threads of a puzzle waiting to be unraveled. The somber atmosphere weighed heavily on him, but it was a sensation he had long since learned to embrace, even to relish. His mind was already turning over the words of the letter that had brought him here. A curse, a locket, a legacy of death. He paused at the front door, his hand resting on the iron knocker for a moment longer than necessary. The sound of his knock reverberated through the halls of the estate, distant and muffled, as if the house itself were holding its breath. A maid appeared at the door, her eyes wide with anxiety as she beckoned him inside. Holmes followed her silently, his sharp eyes noting every detail, the hesitant way she moved, the slight quiver in her hands. He knew she was nervous, but the reason eluded him. The interior of the Monroe estate was dimly lit, the grand chandeliers casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and flicker as the light danced upon the walls. The scent of aged wood and dust lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of something far less inviting, a trace of something almost metallic. Holmes inhaled deeply, not revealing his thoughts, but already cataloguing the sensations that told him far more than anyone could have said aloud. The maid led him through the narrow hallways, each step echoing against the cold stone floors. They arrived at a sitting room where a woman awaited him. Lady Evelyn Monroe, whose pale face was framed by dark, curled hair, sat by the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up as Holmes entered, her gaze sharp yet troubled, a combination that seemed to hold a deeper story. Her eyes lingered on him, studying his figure as if trying to gauge his worth before she spoke. "Mr. Holmes, I presume?" Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension in her tone. Holmes inclined his head. "Lady Monroe," he said with the softest of nods, stepping into the room and surveying the space. "I trust you have not been troubled too much in my absence." Her lips parted in an attempt at a smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "We are troubled indeed, Mr. Holmes. It is not easy to be plagued by a curse, especially when that curse involves the very symbol of our family's history." Holmes took a seat, his keen gaze never leaving her face. "A curse, you say? And the locket?" "Yes, the locket." Her voice faltered slightly as she spoke, and Holmes's attention sharpened. He noted the way her fingers lightly touched the delicate chain at her neck. A brief moment of vulnerability betrayed her composed exterior. "It has brought nothing but misfortune to my family, Mr. Holmes. There have been deaths. And now, we fear it is haunting us once again." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly. You are certain it is the locket? Not some other force at play? Lady Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flicking to the fireplace, as though the answer lay in the flames. I am certain, she said quietly. It belonged to my great-grandmother, who died under suspicious circumstances. It has passed down through the generations, bringing with it nothing but tragedy. Holmes nodded slowly, considering her words. And you suspect that the curse is the cause of these deaths, not a more natural explanation? I do not know, she said, her voice catching in her throat. But I am desperate, Mr. Holmes. I cannot stand to lose another member of my family to it. Holmes stood abruptly, moving toward the window. His mind was already beginning to turn, to make connections between her words and the strange request that had brought him here. There were layers to this case, layers he would have to peel away slowly, one at a time. But there was something in Lady Evelyn's eyes, some glimmer of truth buried beneath the surface of her words. He could see it now. She was hiding something, and it was not just fear of the locket. There was guilt in her gaze. He turned back to face her. I shall need to speak to the other members of your household, Lady Monroe. I must learn more about the events that have transpired. It is only then that I may begin to understand the nature of this curse and the role the locket plays in it. Her eyes flickered with something like relief. Of course, Mr. Holmes. I shall have them brought to you. But please do hurry. We are running out of time. Holmes's gaze softened for a moment, though his mind remained razor-sharp. He had no intention of letting this case slip away. He was already convinced of one thing. There was far more to this than mere superstition. Something darker was at play here, something that would require all of his skill and observation to uncover. And he would not rest until the truth had been laid bare. The conversation with Lady Evelyn Monroe was hardly a minute past when the first of her household servants entered the room. He was a tall man, dressed in the sombre black livery of the Monroe estate, with sharp features and an air of reserve that betrayed little of his thoughts. Holmes studied him for a moment before the man spoke, his voice steady but laced with an edge of unease. Lady Evelyn, you requested my presence? The servant's eyes flicked briefly to Holmes, a look of curiosity, or perhaps suspicion, passing over his face. Lady Evelyn nodded. Yes, Thomas. Mr. Holmes will be conducting the investigation. He will need to speak with the rest of the household. At her words, Thomas's expression softened slightly, though a shadow of apprehension lingered in his gaze. Of course, my lady. I shall fetch Miss Clara first. As Thomas turned to leave, Holmes made no move to speak, yet his eyes followed the servant with careful intent. He had noticed the way the man's hand had trembled slightly when handling the door's latch, small details, but details that spoke of an underlying tension. Whether it was the cursed locket that disturbed him, or something more personal, Holmes could not yet say. But he was certain of one thing. This household was shrouded in unease, and it extended far beyond Lady Evelyn's immediate distress. A few moments passed before the servant returned with a second figure. She was much smaller in stature, and though dressed plainly in a maid's uniform, the way she carried herself spoke volumes. Miss Clara, as Holmes now knew her, entered the room with an air of nervousness that was almost palpable. Her movements were quick and precise, her eyes darting around the space, as if she wished to avoid noticing anything that might give her away. She was not of noble blood, Holmes could tell. Her bearing was that of someone who knew her place well, but carried a weight far heavier than most servants might. She stood before Lady Evelyn with an almost unnatural stillness. Miss Clara, Lady Evelyn greeted her, her tone soft but firm. Mr. Holmes has come to investigate the incidents. He will need your cooperation. Clara nodded sharply, though Holmes noted the tightness of her jaw, the slight quiver in her hands. She was holding something back, something she did not wish to reveal, but he could not discern what yet. For now, he would be patient. Of course, my lady, Clara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes flicked to Holmes, then quickly away, as if she feared what he might discover. How may I assist you, sir? Holmes regarded her for a moment before speaking. His voice was even, calm, but beneath it lay an edge of intensity. I need to ask you some questions regarding the locket and the events surrounding the recent deaths in this house. At the mention of the locket, Clara's face momentarily paled, though she quickly masked her reaction. Holmes saw it, the subtle change in her posture, the faint tremor in her hands. It was enough to pique his interest. The locket, Clara echoed, her voice almost a whisper now. I don't know what you mean, sir. Holmes raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. I believe you do, Miss Clara, he said, his voice low but deliberate. You know more about this matter than you are letting on. Clara flinched, her eyes widening for a split second. Lady Evelyn, sensing the shift in the conversation, interjected softly, Miss Clara, you must speak plainly. Mr. Holmes is here to help, not to accuse. Clara lowered her head, a deep breath escaping her lips. I don't know what you want me to say, sir, she said quietly. I have seen the locket, of course. It's been in the family for years. But You've seen it recently, Holmes interrupted, his gaze intense. You've seen it, and you've seen what it can do. He allowed the words to linger in the room, the weight of them heavy in the silence that followed. I have no doubt you've heard the rumours, the deaths, the strange occurrences. Clara's lips trembled as she fought to maintain composure. Holmes could see the war raging behind her eyes. There was something she desperately wanted to say, but either fear or loyalty, or perhaps a combination of both, kept her from speaking. Please, Miss Clara, Holmes urged, his tone softening, almost coaxing. You need not be afraid. The truth is always a powerful tool. The curse is not the true enemy here. It is the truth itself. And I promise you, I will uncover it. There was a long pause, as Clara seemed to weigh his words, her gaze flicking between him and Lady Evelyn. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. I saw it, Clara admitted, her voice barely above a murmur. I saw the locket, last week. It was different. It wasn't like before. I don't know how to explain it, but when I held it... Her voice faltered, and she paused, as though the memory of the moment was too much for her to bear. It felt heavy, like something was pulling at me, and then I saw something in it. Something dark. Lady Evelyn stiffened at the words, her eyes flashing with an emotion Holmes couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or something deeper. She looked away, her fingers pressing into the armrest of her chair. Holmes leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. What did you see, Miss Clara? What was in the locket? Clara's eyes darted to Lady Evelyn before answering. I saw the face of someone I didn't recognize. It was almost as if the locket was alive, pulling me into it. I know how this must sound, sir, but I'm telling you, there was something in that locket, something evil. Holmes's mind raced as he processed her words. A locket that seemed alive. The implications were impossible to ignore, yet his mind refused to accept the supernatural explanation that Clara's description hinted at. There had to be a logical explanation, a rational reason behind what she saw. But what could it be? The dim light of early morning filtered through the cracked curtains of Holmes's study as he sat back in his chair, deep in thought. The eerie description of the locket's effect on Miss Clara haunted him, but his mind refused to accept the notion that something so supernatural could be at the centre of the case. The weight of the mystery pressed heavily on his shoulders. He was interrupted by the brisk knock at the door, a sound that had become all too familiar in recent days. Holmes, Dr. Watson's voice called from the doorway. You're needed at the scene. Another has died. Holmes's sharp gaze flicked up, his eyes narrowing in response to the news. The scent of ink from his scattered papers filled the air, mingling with the mustiness of the old wooden walls. He rose quickly from his chair, grabbing his coat as he turned to Watson. His mind already raced ahead, sifting through the possibilities. "Who?" Holmes asked, his voice calm, though tinged with a subtle urgency. "The young man who worked for the Monroes. The one who had been close to Miss Clara, if the rumours are to be believed. They found him this morning." Without another word, they made their way through the twisting corridors of the house, the chill in the air biting at their skin. Holmes's every step echoed through the halls, but he allowed no distraction to break his focus. As they reached the foot of the staircase, the sound of footsteps ahead signalled their arrival at the crime scene. The door to the study was ajar, and a faint smell of decay lingered in the air, an unsettling, metallic scent that Holmes immediately registered as out of place. Dr. Watson paused at the doorway, his brow furrowed. "Holmes, this looks strange." Holmes pushed the door open with his usual precision. The sight that greeted him was nothing short of chilling. The room was in disarray, as if someone had been searching frantically for something. Books lay scattered across the floor, overturned chairs abandoned in haste. Yet it was the young man's body, slumped across a desk, that drew Holmes's immediate attention. The victim's face was pale, his eyes wide open in shock, as though he had seen something far beyond the ordinary. His hand still clutched at the locket, the same ghostly piece of jewellery that had been mentioned so many times in passing. But it was no longer a mere trinket. The locket gleamed unnaturally against the dim light, as though it held some sinister power that even Holmes could not fully explain. "Holmes," Watson's voice was strained, "this does not look like a simple death. The boy, he appears to have died in fear." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he approached the body, his every movement deliberate and careful. He took a step closer, his gaze flicking between the victim's face and the locket he still gripped tightly. With a practiced hand, Holmes gently pried the locket from the boy's cold fingers, noting the lightness of the piece. It felt almost weightless in his palm, and yet there was something about it that unsettled him deeply. It was as though the locket was watching him back, its twisted engraving seeming to pulse with a life of its own. "What do you make of this?" Watson asked, his voice low, his brow furrowed in confusion. Holmes glanced up, his gaze flicking over the room once more, examining the chaos in minute detail. There was no sign of a struggle, nothing that indicated violence. Yet the sense of fear that permeated the air was undeniable. The young man had died in a state of terror, that much was clear. But what could have caused it? Holmes's attention returned to the locket. "It appears the boy was obsessed with this cursed artifact," he mused aloud, though the words seemed hollow in the vast empty space of the room. "But this does not explain why he died. No physical harm was done to him, no marks left on his body. And yet, there is something..." His voice trailed off as he examined the locket more closely. There was a subtle engraving on the back of the locket, one that had previously been hidden beneath the folds of its chain. Holmes's fingertips traced the etching, his brow furrowing with growing concentration. It was a symbol that was not of this time, its origins foreign to even his extensive knowledge. "I have seen this before," Holmes muttered to himself. "But where?" Watson leaned over, peering at the engraving. "What is it? Some kind of family crest?" "No," Holmes replied, his voice quiet, almost to himself. "It's something older, something darker." For a moment, Holmes stood in silence, allowing his mind to process the influx of details. The boy's fear, the strange engraving, the locket's significance. It was all beginning to form a pattern. Yet, Holmes knew better than to jump to conclusions. There were still too many unanswered questions. How had the locket come to possess such power? Why was it that only certain individuals seemed affected by it? And most importantly, why had the boy died clutching it, his final moments so filled with terror? As he looked back at the body, Holmes noticed something else, something that had eluded him at first. The letter, the one that had been partially burned, was still visible in the fireplace. It had not been completely consumed, and there, near the edge, was the faintest trace of ink that was still legible. Holmes moved swiftly to the hearth, pulling the letter from the smouldering embers. He smoothed it carefully, though some of the paper had begun to disintegrate under the heat. As he read the words, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift once again. It was a message from the young man to Lady Evelyn, warning her about the locket. The last line of the letter was nearly unreadable, but one word stood out above the rest. Danger. Watson joined him, reading over his shoulder. What does this mean, Holmes? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his eyes back to the locket, his mind racing. It was clear that the boy's death was no accident. The locket had played a part, and perhaps even controlled the boy's final moments. But how? With the letter in hand, Holmes stepped back into the centre of the room, his expression shifting from one of deep thought to cold determination. The truth was beginning to emerge, but it was still wrapped in a veil of uncertainty, and he knew that he would have to peel back each layer, one by one, before he could see the full picture. The room seemed to hold its breath as Holmes's gaze returned to the locket once more, its dark presence looming over everything. The late morning sun struggled through the fog as Holmes and Watson left the scene of the young man's death. The air was damp and bitterly cold, pressing against their skin like a tangible force. Holmes walked briskly, his mind racing as the weight of the new developments settled around him. Every small detail, the boy's fear, the letter's warning, the cryptic engraving on the locket, was a piece of a larger puzzle, one he could not yet see clearly. Dr. Watson fell into step beside him, his face furrowed in thought. Holmes, it seems impossible to dismiss the idea that something supernatural is at play here. The boy's death. It was as though he saw something beyond reason. What are we to make of this? Holmes did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the cobbled streets ahead. The rhythmic sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence, but his mind was a whirl of calculations and deductions. Watson, Holmes said finally, we must consider all possibilities, of course. But I cannot afford to let my mind wander to places that offer no clarity. There is always a logical explanation. Always. Watson sighed, still unconvinced. You can be relentless, Holmes, even in the face of the impossible. Holmes shot him a glance, his eyes sharp. It is not a matter of belief, Watson. It is a matter of facts. The carriage that had been waiting for them outside the estate now pulled into motion, its dark, worn wood creaking under the weight of the mystery ahead. Holmes and Watson climbed inside, the interior dim but warm. The horses' steady clop against the cobblestones was the only sound as they made their way toward the Monroe estate again. This time, Holmes knew the conversation would take a different turn. He needed to gather more information, question the rest of the household, and look for connections that might tie this death to the others that had preceded it. As they arrived at the grand estate, Holmes turned to Watson. We will begin with Lady Evelyn once more. If there is a secret she is withholding, it must be uncovered. Afterward, I will speak with the maid again. Miss Clara's reaction to the locket was telling. She knows more than she lets on. Watson nodded, though his brow furrowed in concern. And the locket itself? You think it has some influence? Holmes gave Watson a look of quiet resolve. I believe the locket is central to this. But how exactly is something I intend to determine. The sound of the carriage doors opening broke their conversation, and they stepped out into the grounds of the estate once more. The air was sharper now, biting at their skin as they made their way toward the front door. Holmes was always conscious of his surroundings, of every shift in the atmosphere. There was something oppressive about this house, a heaviness that had little to do with its size, and more to do with the history it held within its walls. Thomas, the servant from earlier, met them at the door, his face as unreadable as ever. He led them once more to the sitting room, where Lady Evelyn awaited. She stood by the window, her back to them, as she gazed out into the garden, the curtains drawn tightly against the mist that clung to the ground outside. Her posture was stiff, her expression distant, as though she were lost in a thought she did not wish to share. Holmes regarded her carefully as he entered, noting the tightness of her shoulders and the way she refused to meet his gaze. It seemed that every encounter with her only served to deepen his suspicion. There was something amiss, something beyond the obvious grief. "Lady Monroe?" Holmes said, his voice calm yet probing. "I must ask you again. What exactly happened when you first came into possession of the locket?" She turned slowly, her gaze flicking toward him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and the corners of her lips tightened. She knew, Holmes could sense it, that he was circling closer to something she did not wish to reveal. "I told you everything," Lady Evelyn replied, her voice trembling slightly but still holding a certain aristocratic composure. "It was given to me by my grandmother. It's part of the family's legacy, Mr. Holmes. I cannot speak of it any more clearly." Holmes studied her with a steady gaze. "You do not seem convinced that this is just a family heirloom, Lady Monroe. And if you are being truthful, then why does it hold such power over you? Why is it that you cannot let it go?" There was a flicker in her eyes, a moment of hesitation. Holmes saw it, the first crack in her perfectly constructed facade. I don't know what you mean," she said softly, though Holmes could hear the quiet plea beneath her words. "It's nothing more than a trinket, just an heirloom." Holmes let her words hang in the air, refusing to break the silence. After a long pause, he spoke again. "There have been deaths, Lady Monroe. And not just any deaths. The locket is involved in all of them, one way or another. Do you truly believe it is just a coincidence?" She seemed to deflate at the mention of the deaths, the colour draining from her face. She looked away, but not before Holmes caught the faintest tremble in her lip. "I don't know," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I don't know what it is, Mr. Holmes, but I feel as though it has cursed us. Cursed my family. Cursed me." Holmes took a step closer, his mind moving faster than the conversation could follow. "And Miss Clara? What is her connection to this locket?" She reacted quite strongly when she spoke of it. Lady Evelyn hesitated. The pause was too long, her thoughts drifting elsewhere. "Clara? She's been with us for years. She knows the family history. But she's different. She's always been superstitious, prone to wild ideas." "Superstitions often have their basis in truth," Holmes said quietly, his gaze never leaving Lady Evelyn's face. "I intend to speak with Miss Clara once more." The lady's eyes widened, her expression shifting for the first time since their arrival. "Please, Mr. Holmes, don't press her further. She is troubled. You will get nothing from her." Holmes tilted his head, watching her closely. "We will see about that, Lady Monroe. I intend to find the truth, and I suspect it lies within the walls of this estate." The house felt quieter now, the heavy silence lingering in the corners of every room. Holmes had barely stepped into the hallway when Thomas, the servant, appeared again, as if summoned by an unseen hand. He gave a brief nod to Holmes and Dr. Watson, leading them up the stairs with a measured pace that seemed to echo through the cold stone walls. There was something about the atmosphere of the estate that unnerved Watson. It wasn't just the death they had already encountered. There was a palpable tension that seemed to cling to the air itself, something out of reach yet deeply unsettling. Thomas led them down a narrow corridor to a modest door, which he opened to reveal the maid, Miss Clara. She was sitting by a small window, her face turned away as though she had been lost in thought, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her posture was stiff, her presence subdued. She did not rise when Holmes and Watson entered, though her eyes flickered up briefly, as if gauging the severity of their arrival. "Miss Clara," Holmes began, his voice smooth but carrying the weight of the investigation. "I understand you are not feeling well, but I must insist on speaking with you once more." Clara's hands twitched slightly as she adjusted her position. There was a stiffness in her manner, something that conveyed the discomfort she felt under Holmes's direct gaze. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. I told you all I know, Mr. Holmes. There is nothing more to say." Holmes regarded her carefully, sensing the walls she had built around herself. "Miss Clara," he said, taking a step closer, "you said you saw something in the locket, something that made you afraid. This is not something one can simply dismiss." Clara's eyes widened for a brief moment, but she quickly lowered her gaze again. Her lips trembled, though she did her best to hide it. She broke off, pressing her lips together as though battling an inner conflict. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress. I should not have said anything. I was frightened, Mr. Holmes. That's all." Holmes was silent for a moment, his gaze steady. He did not press her immediately. Instead, he studied her, watching as her nervousness seeped into the room like a thick fog. She was hiding something. He could feel it. He took a step back, giving her a moment of space, before continuing with a gentler tone. "Miss Clara, I understand your fear," he said softly. "But in order to truly help Lady Evelyn, we must uncover the truth. You must trust me." Her eyes flickered toward him again, and for the briefest of moments, Holmes saw something like hesitation in her gaze. But then it was gone, replaced once more by the mask of distance she had perfected. I will tell you," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "But you must promise that it will remain between us. No one else must know." Holmes inclined his head, his expression serious. "I give you my word." Clara drew a shaky breath and began, her words coming out slowly at first, as though she was unsure whether or not she should continue. "The night the locket arrived in this house again, it was different. There was something unnatural about it. I don't know how to explain it." She looked up briefly, her face pale. "The air grew cold, Mr. Holmes, and there were whispers in the dark. I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard a voice." Holmes leaned in, his eyes fixed on her with undivided attention. "A voice? What did it say?" Clara's voice was barely audible now, her eyes scanning the room as if she feared someone might overhear. "It called my name. It said that I was the key. And then..." She faltered, her breath catching in her throat. "It promised me that I would be free." A shiver ran down Watson's spine at the words, and even Holmes felt a coldness creeping into the air around them. The details were strange, unexplainable, but they were too specific to ignore. The locket, whatever its power, was more than just an object. It was manipulating the minds of those it came into contact with. But why Miss Clara? And what did she mean by the key? Holmes regarded her silently for a long moment, allowing the weight of her confession to sink in. He could feel the tension building again, the same sense of foreboding that had followed them since the moment they stepped into the estate. Something was coming to light, something darker and more dangerous than they had anticipated. "Miss Clara," Holmes said, his voice firm but calm, "I believe you are in danger. You must tell me everything you know about the locket and how it came into your possession." She shook her head, her face twisting in fear. I don't know how it came to be in my hands, but I did touch it that night, and that's when everything started to change. The whispers. Everything." She paused, her voice faltering. "I don't want to be part of this anymore, Mr. Holmes. I just want it to stop." Holmes's gaze softened ever so slightly, though his mind was already racing ahead. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but they were still scattered. There were far more questions than answers. Before Holmes could speak again, they were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Thomas appeared once more, his expression strained. "Lady Evelyn requests your presence," he said, his tone lower than usual, a hint of unease in his voice. "There has been another development." Holmes's eyes flicked to Watson before he turned back to Clara. "We will continue this discussion later," he promised, though it was clear that more questions remained. As they made their way out of the room, the oppressive tension in the air seemed to tighten, as if the very walls were closing in on them. The hallway of the Monroe estate was eerily quiet as Holmes and Watson followed Thomas down the narrow corridor toward Lady Evelyn's private chambers. The dim light from the oil lamps cast long shadows across the polished floorboards, their reflections stretching far beyond their reach. The house itself seemed to pulse with a hidden life, as though it were watching them, waiting for them to uncover its secrets. Holmes, despite his usual composure, felt a growing unease gnawing at him. There were too many contradictions, too many hidden motivations at play. The locket, the whispers, the deaths, they were all connected, but in what way? And why had Lady Evelyn been so hesitant to speak of the full history of the cursed artifact? Her reactions, her lies. He could sense that she was hiding something vital, something that could unravel the entire case. As they reached the door to Lady Evelyn's study, Thomas paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Lady Evelyn is expecting you, Mr. Holmes. She's very upset." Holmes gave a curt nod, his mind already elsewhere. "Thank you, Thomas," he said briefly before entering the room. The air was heavy with the scent of old books and fresh ink. A large desk dominated the space, papers scattered across its surface in a haphazard fashion. Lady Evelyn stood by the window, her posture stiff and guarded, though her back was to them, her face hidden from view. "Lady Monroe," Holmes began, his voice smooth but carrying a weight of authority. "You requested to see me?" Lady Evelyn turned slowly, her eyes red-rimmed, though she quickly wiped away the trace of tears before speaking. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. There has been another incident," she said, her voice strained. She stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It's the locket. It is doing something to us, Mr. Holmes. Something terrible." Holmes observed her carefully, noting the way she held herself. Every gesture, every breath seemed controlled, almost rehearsed. There was something forced about her demeanor, as though she were trying to present a calm facade, but it was quickly unraveling. Holmes could see the cracks, the unease hidden beneath the surface. "What exactly has happened this time, Lady Monroe?" Holmes asked, his tone direct but patient. "You have my full attention." She hesitated, as though grappling with how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke in a whisper, her voice faltering. "It's Clara. She's become obsessed with the locket. She's changed, Mr. Holmes. Lady Evelyn paused, her hands trembling as she wrung them together. "She believes she is being called by it, that it is guiding her." Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, a silent understanding passing between them. Miss Clara's earlier admission about hearing whispers, about feeling as though she was being drawn to the locket, now took on a darker hue. The maid's fears were no longer irrational, no longer the product of superstition. There was something far more tangible at play here. "Is it the locket itself causing this behavior?" Holmes asked, though he knew that this was just the beginning of a far more intricate question. "Or is there something else at work here, Lady Monroe?" Lady Evelyn pressed her lips together, clearly torn. I don't know, but I feel it, Mr. Holmes. I can see the changes in her. There is something wrong with her now. And I fear that if this continues, we will lose her." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze piercing as it fixed on Lady Evelyn. "And you fear you might lose something more, don't you?" She flinched, her eyes flickering away from his. The sudden shift in her demeanor did not escape Holmes's notice. Her entire body stiffened, as though she had been caught in a lie, but she quickly masked the brief lapse with a forced sigh. "I've already lost enough," Lady Evelyn murmured, her voice barely audible. Holmes continued his silent observation. There was something she was not saying, something that had to do with Clara, but he would not press her just yet. He needed more. And the truth, he knew, often revealed itself in fragments, small inconsistencies, discrepancies between words and actions, the moments when people were not quite so careful. "I would like to speak with Miss Clara again," Holmes said, his voice unwavering. Lady Evelyn's expression faltered. Mr. Holmes, Lady Monroe, Holmes interrupted gently, but with undeniable firmness. You must allow me to do my work. Only then will we understand what is truly happening. There was a long silence before Lady Evelyn nodded reluctantly, her gaze never meeting his. Of course, Mr. Holmes. I will fetch her. Holmes stood still, his mind working at full capacity, dissecting the situation piece by piece. There were contradictions in Lady Evelyn's story, gaps in the history she had provided. How could Clara, a woman so obviously fearful of the locket, now be so attached to it? Was it truly the influence of the locket, or was there something else at work? Was Lady Evelyn hiding her own connection to the object? It was clear that Clara's behaviour was escalating, but it was equally clear that Lady Evelyn's involvement was far from innocent. As Lady Evelyn left the room to fetch Clara, Holmes turned to Watson, his brow furrowed in thought. There is more here than meets the eye, Watson. I am certain of it. Watson stepped closer, his voice low but filled with concern. But what are we missing, Holmes? What could make Clara change so suddenly? And what is it about the locket? Holmes did not immediately answer. His gaze shifted to the cluttered desk, where a stack of papers caught his attention. They seemed like nothing more than old correspondence, but as he sifted through them, one document caught his eye. It was a letter dated several months ago, just before the first death occurred. The handwriting was familiar. Holmes held the letter up to the light, studying it closely. Watson, Holmes said, his voice edged with a quiet urgency. I believe we're about to uncover the key to this entire mystery. The room had grown quieter since Lady Evelyn's departure, leaving Holmes and Watson in a heavy silence. The warmth of the fire crackled softly in the hearth, the flames dancing in the dim light of the room. Holmes stood by the desk, still holding the letter that had piqued his attention. Its weight seemed heavier than it should have been, its contents far more critical than either of them had first realized. Watson leaned against the doorframe, watching Holmes with a mixture of anticipation and concern. He had seen this before. Holmes in his element, piecing together the puzzle with relentless focus, ignoring everything around him. But this case was different. There was an edge to it, a sense that something more sinister was at work. Holmes could feel it too, the shift in the air, as if the very walls of the estate were closing in on them. I think, Holmes began quietly, still holding the letter, I think we have been looking at this case from the wrong angle. Watson raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Holmes dropped the letter onto the desk with a soft thud and turned to face his friend. We've been operating under the assumption that the locket itself is the cause of these deaths, that it possesses some dark power. But that is not what I believe is at play here. No, the locket is a catalyst, a tool, and it is not the object that holds the power, but rather the person who controls it. Watson stepped forward, his brow furrowing. The person who controls it. But Lady Evelyn has made it clear she's terrified of the locket. How could she? That's just it, Holmes interrupted, his voice sharpening. Lady Evelyn's fear is a cover. Fear is the perfect weapon when you want to manipulate others, when you want them to believe that something is beyond their control. The locket is a means to an end. It is a tool she uses to exert power over the others in the house. Watson's expression was one of disbelief, though he was no stranger to Holmes's deductive process. But why? What would she have to gain from manipulating them like this? Holmes's eyes narrowed as he spoke, his voice quieter, but filled with the weight of his theory. Power. Control. But also, something far more personal. The letter I found, Watson. Look at the date. He gestured toward the document on the desk. It was written by Lady Evelyn herself, months before the first death. And what does it say? Watson approached the desk, picking up the letter with a slow, deliberate motion. He read it quickly, his face changing as he absorbed its contents. It's a letter of warning, Watson muttered. To whom? Holmes's gaze never left his friend's face. To someone named Michael Hargrove. The name appears throughout the estate's correspondence. He was close to Lady Evelyn, far closer than anyone realized. It seems they were involved in an affair. And it seems his death, his mysterious death, was no accident. Watson's face paled as the implications began to sink in. Are you suggesting that Lady Evelyn killed him? Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out into the misty garden. The fog seemed to press in against the glass, casting an almost unnatural pallor over the world outside. I don't believe she killed him outright, Holmes said finally, his voice soft but filled with certainty. But I do believe she drove him to his death. The locket was the trigger. It was a tool of manipulation, a means to keep him under her control. And when he tried to escape, to sever ties with her, he became a target. Watson absorbed this revelation in silence, his mind working through the details, the contradictions. But what about the others? He asked, his voice strained. The maid, the boy who died, Miss Clara. Holmes turned back to face him, his eyes sharp and calculating. The locket's power lies in its ability to manipulate, but it requires a willing participant, someone susceptible to its influence. Miss Clara is the perfect candidate. She is the one most willing to believe in its power, to accept it as something supernatural. And the young man who died, he was an accomplice, one who grew too bold. He tried to expose the truth, and that cost him his life. But why would she involve Clara? Why manipulate her? Watson asked, his voice filled with confusion. Holmes let out a breath, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Because Clara knows something. She knows something about Lady Evelyn's past, something dark. And now, she is the only one left who could expose the truth. The locket is merely the means by which Lady Evelyn keeps her under control. She is using Clara to shield herself, to keep her secrets buried. Watson's gaze shifted uneasily toward the door. And what happens now? What do we do about it? Holmes walked toward the desk, his fingers drumming lightly on its surface as he thought. We confront Lady Evelyn, of course, but we must do it carefully. She is clever, far more so than she lets on. We need to catch her off guard, to get her to reveal her true intentions. Only then will we understand the full extent of her manipulation. The weight of the case seemed to settle around them, its full implications just beginning to unfold. Holmes's mind raced ahead, already formulating the next steps. There was still much to uncover, still many threads to untangle. But now, for the first time, he felt he was closing in on the heart of the mystery. Watson stood by the window, watching Holmes with a mixture of awe and caution. Holmes, he said quietly, you've found the key. But how can we be sure it will end with Lady Evelyn? Holmes turned slowly to face his companion, a glint of resolve in his eyes. We won't know for certain, Watson, but I will see this through. I always do. The mansion seemed to hold its breath as Holmes and Watson made their way to Lady Evelyn's private drawing room. The heavy air clung to their skin as they passed through the cold, dimly lit halls. The house was alive with secrets, silent witnesses to the events that had unfolded within these walls. Holmes felt the weight of those secrets pressing down on him as he entered the drawing room, his mind sharp with the deductions he had gathered. This was the moment he had been preparing for. Lady Evelyn stood by the large, ornate fireplace, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the room. Her posture was rigid, as if she had been waiting for them for hours, her eyes distant and unreadable. The locket, always close to her, seemed to pulse in the low light, its presence heavy and oppressive. Holmes had known that this confrontation would not be easy, but he had never expected it to be quite so tense. There was something palpable in the room, something that made the very air feel charged with anticipation. Mr. Holmes? Lady Evelyn's voice was cool, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as she turned to face him. You've come to accuse me, haven't you? Holmes stood still for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Not to accuse, Lady Monroe. I'm here to hear the truth." She gave a strained smile, her lips trembling slightly. "The truth?" She repeated the word, her voice laced with bitterness. "And what truth would that be, Mr. Holmes? The truth about a cursed object that has haunted my family for generations? The truth about my past? Or perhaps the truth about the lengths I've gone to protect it all?" Holmes could hear the tension in her voice now, the cracks beginning to form in her composure. She was desperate to maintain control, but it was slipping. And Holmes, ever patient, knew the truth was within his reach. He took a step forward, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of certainty. "You've been manipulating everyone, Lady Monroe. Clara, the young man who died, even your own family. You've used fear, superstition, and the curse of the locket to keep them under your thumb. But the truth is far simpler than you would have liked to believe." Lady Evelyn's eyes flashed with anger, her fingers tightening around the locket she held in her hand. "You don't understand, Mr. Holmes," she said through gritted teeth. "You can't possibly understand. I did what I had to do to survive, to protect what was mine." "Protect?" Holmes's voice was sharp, his eyes never leaving her face. "You've been using the locket to manipulate, to control those around you. And now, because of it, lives have been lost. The boy who died, the maid, Miss Clara. Do you think they were mere pawns in your game?" Lady Evelyn recoiled at his words, her face paling. "You don't know what it was like," she whispered, almost to herself. "The pressure, the demands, the choices I had to make." Watson stepped forward, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "Lady Evelyn, this has gone on long enough. There's no more hiding. You've used the locket to cast a shadow over everyone here, but the truth is out. We know about Michael Hargrove, about the affair. You were using the locket to manipulate him, and when he tried to break free, you—" "Enough!" Lady Evelyn's voice cracked, the words laced with an almost hysterical edge. She stepped back, her hands trembling, and for the first time, Holmes saw the raw vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. She was cornered, and she knew it. The facade was crumbling, revealing the true depths of her desperation. "You don't understand," she repeated, her voice trembling with emotion. "He was going to ruin everything. He threatened to expose me, to ruin my family's reputation. The locket, it was my only choice. I had to make him stay, to make him love me. And when he refused, when he wanted to leave, I made him pay." Holmes's gaze softened for a brief moment, but only a brief one. "And what of Clara? What of the maid you've manipulated for your own purposes?" Lady Evelyn's eyes flickered, and for the first time, a true sadness crossed her face. "Clara, she's a fool. She always has been. But she was my only ally. She knew too much, and I had to keep her close. She wasn't strong enough to resist. But now—" Her voice trailed off, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "Now she's lost to me too." Holmes took a step closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "You used the locket to control them, Lady Monroe. But you're not the one in control anymore. The truth has been revealed, and it will not be silenced." Lady Evelyn's shoulders slumped, her body folding in on itself, as if the weight of her guilt had finally become too much to bear. She let the locket fall from her hand, the silver chain clinking as it hit the floor. She stared down at it for a long moment, her expression hollow, as though the very object that had been her means of power had now become her undoing. "You should have left it alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The locket should never have come back to this house." Holmes didn't answer immediately. He could see the anguish in her eyes, the regret that had come too late. But he also saw the truth that she had used fear and manipulation to control those around her, to keep them in line, to keep them in her grasp. The locket had been her tool, but in the end, it was the truth that had undone her, As the silence stretched on, Holmes finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "It's over now, Lady Monroe. The damage you've done cannot be undone, but you will answer for your actions." Lady Evelyn's gaze flickered toward the locket on the floor, and then, without another word, she sank to her knees. The fight had left her, and for the first time, Holmes saw the full extent of her guilt, the crushing weight of her own choices. The mystery was solved. But in the end, it was not the locket that had been the true enemy. It was the darkness within the heart of the woman who had wielded it. The morning after the confrontation was cold, the sun barely managing to break through the heavy mist that clung to the city. Holmes stood by the window of his modest study, his gaze fixed on the grey streets below. The case had been resolved, but the weight of it lingered. There was a certain finality in the silence that had settled over the Monroe estate, an eerie calm after the storm. The woman who had once been at the centre of the mystery now sat confined, her guilt and remorse echoing through the halls. Lady Evelyn Monroe had been arrested, her manipulation and crimes laid bare for all to see. Yet, even now, Holmes could not shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he had uncovered. As he stood in thought, Watson entered the room, his usual presence a comforting contrast to the tense atmosphere that had permeated the investigation. His face was a mixture of satisfaction and unease, as if the resolution of the case had not entirely brought him peace. "Well, Holmes," Watson said, his voice breaking the silence, "it's done. Lady Evelyn has been taken into custody. The house is quiet once more." Holmes turned to face him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yes, it is. But I cannot help but wonder, Watson, if we truly understand everything that transpired." Watson raised an eyebrow, taking a seat across from Holmes. "What do you mean? The facts are clear enough. She used the locket to manipulate Clara, to control everyone around her, and when things began to unravel, she turned to desperation." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he stared out the window again, his expression thoughtful. "It's not the manipulation that bothers me, Watson. It's the silence that follows. Lady Evelyn was not the only one involved in this, not truly. She was merely the puppet master, controlling the strings from behind the scenes. There is something darker at play here, something that was buried in the past, in the very origins of the locket." Watson frowned, sensing the unease in his friend's tone. "Are you suggesting that there's more to this curse? That the locket itself is something beyond what we've seen?" Holmes turned to face Watson, his eyes sharper than usual. "The locket is not simply an object, Watson. It is a symbol of power, of control, and power always comes with a price. Lady Evelyn may have been the one to use it, but the origins of the locket, the dark history behind it, that is where the true mystery lies. We've only scratched the surface." Watson absorbed his words, the weight of them sinking in. "You believe the locket's influence extends beyond Lady Evelyn? That there is something deeper at work here?" Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I do, but perhaps it is not for us to uncover. Some things are meant to remain hidden." There was a pause as both men considered the implications of this. The resolution of the case had brought justice, but it had also raised more questions than answers. Holmes had solved the mystery of Lady Evelyn's manipulation, but the curse of the locket, its true origins and the depth of its power, still loomed like a shadow in the corners of his mind. The quiet was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, and a moment later, Thomas appeared at the door. His face was drawn, his expression uncertain. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice low. "There's something you should know. Miss Clara, she's gone." The news hit like a blow, the words lingering in the air like smoke. Holmes's gaze sharpened as he stood abruptly, his mind already racing. "Gone? What do you mean, Thomas?" Thomas hesitated, his eyes flicking between the two men. She left last night. There was nothing to indicate where she went, but I believe she took the locket with her." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes, both men understanding the gravity of the situation. Clara had been their last link to the truth, the one person who had witnessed the locket's influence firsthand. And now, she was gone. Holmes's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in rapid succession. Miss Clara had been the one who had felt the full force of the locket's power. She had been manipulated, yes, but there was something else at play. The locket was no ordinary object. It had a life of its own, one that was capable of drawing people in, of bending them to its will. "We must find her," Holmes said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "If Clara has taken the locket, she is in grave danger. We cannot let this matter go unresolved." Thomas nodded, his face pale. "I'll help in any way I can, Mr. Holmes, but I fear she may be beyond our reach now." Watson's gaze was filled with concern as he spoke, his voice edged with frustration. "Holmes, where do we even begin? She could be anywhere by now." Holmes paused, his brow furrowing as he thought through their options. "We begin with what we know. Clara is not the type to leave without reason. She's frightened, confused. And she's not alone in this. The locket will guide her, just as it guided Lady Evelyn. But where?" There was no answer immediately. The room fell silent once more, the weight of their next steps pressing on them. Holmes's mind was racing, but he knew they had little time. Clara was a key part of this puzzle, and her disappearance only deepened the mystery. If they were to find her, they would need to understand the locket's true nature, and that meant going deeper into the past than they had ever gone before. The air felt heavier, charged with uncertainty. Holmes and Watson exchanged one final look, their shared resolve clear in their eyes. The case was far from over.